Hello, class. I hope you could hear me. Um, we're we're doing something unusual this week, whereby are we'll be listening to a podcast and then also a couple of lectures that I'm going to be recording. And the podcast is by a gentleman named Patrick O'Connor, who is a philosopher in his own right, and also a Finnish philosopher whose name is Olli Lagerspetz as well. Because Olli Lagerspetz wrote a book titled The Philosophy of Dirt. And so I'm thinking that this would be an interesting segue into how it is that we're understanding problems of COVID, and then also to pick up where we left off by also touching on how this is connected to ethics of care as well, which I think has an interesting corollary. So when we are thinking of the problem of dirt, this is obviously a relevant issue for our relationship to COVID-19 and the worldwide pandemic, namely in terms of how it is that we're understanding this acute awareness of washing our hands, the hand-to-face contact, and also the social distancing. So keeping us away from infection has to do with also, we could extend that to how it is that we're understanding things that are dirty and versus things that are clean. Because part of the problem with the virus is obviously its invisibility. So the invisibility presents a problem because we don't know exactly what is infected slash dirty, right? And also there's another connection too with the reference that the COVID virus originated from people eating bats that they got at this wet market in China, where the COVID-19 virus originated. And then likewise, there's also an extension to pangolins, and pangolins are a cross between an anteater and an armadillo. So I don't know if the people are eating the meat of the armadillo or if they're using the scales for traditional medicine, exactly how that works. But a lot of the issue and the problem is that people are ingesting something that is not clean because the sanitary conditions at this market are not stringent at all. It's rather unsanitary how this meat is processed and butchered, etc. Okay, so there's the issue of dirt as far as how it is that we understand partly how it is that we understand some of the problem with COVID as well. Okay, and so I thought of bringing in the philosophy of dirt, and Olli Lagerspetz mentions its precedent in ancient philosophy. So we can think of the pre-Socratic Heraclitus, who has the famous fragment, pigs enjoy filth more than they do pure water. And then there's also another profound fragment of his as well, that's basically corpses are more fit to be cast out than dung, which really gets your mind thinking about what it is that he was actually trying to communicate. And because all of his philosophy is in fragments, it's hard to say exactly what he was trying to communicate there. But we can get the sense that this idea, that where we have this idea of corpses as unclean, right? And then likewise, he also mentions Diogenes as well, Diogenes the cynic, because with cynicism, remember, cynicism was a form of, it's an ascetic practice as well. And so part of Diogenes' way of accessing his asceticism had to do with not bathing very often, unusually. So he was getting in touch with his humanity by not staying very clean. And then likewise, I was remembering as well today that there's this interesting, I don't know the exact quote, but it has to do with this idea that he thought that corpses should be thrown over the city walls and fed to the dogs. So there's an interesting cynic corollary as well to how it is that we're understanding corpses as unclean. Then the other connection that we have is to Plato and Socrates, where Plato and Socrates are famous for the theory of forms. And so the theory of forms, we could basically say, has to do with how it is that we understand the ideal sense of things versus their realistic embodiment or actualization of those things. So in other words, the physical embodiment of things actually is less than the perfect ideal of those things, right? So we might have a perfect idea of this notebook, for example, whereby the notebook is always somehow less than perfect. Once I write in it, it's not perfectly blank, that sort of thing, okay? So, but in the dialogue that Lagerapetz mentions, titled Parmenides, Parmenides challenges this theory of forms in relationship to, by calling into question for Socrates this idea of dirt. So in other words, how is it that we're thinking of dirt as ideal? So in other words, can we have dirt? Can we have an ideal sense of what dirt is, right? And I think that part of the conclusion is that the answer is no. That in other words, dirt is really less than ideal, so it's a privation of the good. So it's a privation of the ideal. So in other words, it might be breaking down or a disorder from the order of the good. Because always remember that with Socrates and Plato, this still is aiming toward the good, as we had been indicating with some of the other ethical philosophers that we were considering, such as Aquinas, likewise Aristotle. So this aim toward the good also becomes an aim toward the ideal. So in other words, the idea of having ideal dirt seems somehow ridiculous to Plato and Socrates, because dirt is a defilement of that which is pure. Okay, so that isn't necessarily Olli Lagerspetz's view, but he's bringing it in as a historical / philosophical precedent for our relationship of thinking about the philosophy of dirt, right? And so we have that account, but when we think about how it is that we understand what Olli Lagerapetz is doing, he's basically trying to think about how it is that we're in relation to things, right? And I myself would extend that over to how it is that we are in relation to people as well. So in other words, how is it that we're in relation to things in terms of whether things are functioning in a good way, whether things are needing to be fixed, right? Because oftentimes things that need to be fixed need to have dirt cleaned out of them, right? So like with our cars, one of the reasons why we clean the oil is so that the motor runs more efficiently, because when the oil is dirty, it breaks down the engine faster, right? So a higher functioning car is one with cleaner oil, that sort of thing, right? So, and then likewise in terms of our livelihoods, right? If we're keeping our house clean, we're going to have a better sense of how it is that we're keeping organized in our lives and perhaps have a more fruitful life, right? So he also mentions as well someone who's a little bit in contrast to his theory, Mary Douglas, and she is writing about how it is that dirt is symbolic, and he doesn't necessarily agree with everything she's saying, other than to acknowledge that we can think of dirt as more symbolic than actual as well. So in other words, dirt's not always actual, it also is an idea of dirt, right? So in other words, we identify things as dirty that don't necessarily have a physical component of having a dirt on them, right? So like sin, for example, might be a way of thinking about that. But with Mary Douglas, she had the problem of thinking about dirt as we sometimes think of beauty. So dirt is in the eye of the beholder, but dirt as in the eye of the beholder becomes somewhat relative. So we have that problem. So we can't think of dirt as relative strictly as olli lagerapetz implies, because, for example, when people look at a sink of dirty dishes, they don't automatically think that this is subjective. To think, oh, well, those dirty dishes are somehow subjective. The dirt on those dishes is somehow up to my subjective judgment. No, we have an objective understanding of how it is that we understand that dirt, and we see it as something that's contributing to a function in our lives. In other words, if we wash those dishes, we're going to be better off the next time we set out to have a meal. And what are those implications in terms of how it is that we're thinking of living our lives, right? So that's really important. And so what I'm going to be doing in the next video is trying to tie this into how it is that olli lagerapetz is thinking about care as well, and then maybe a little bit of a segue into the account of feminism as well. So stay tuned for video 2, and we'll try to wrap up this notion of how it is that we're thinking of dirt with olli lagerapetz and take it from there. Thanks.